Well, as we begin the roller coaster into the holidays, we come in the church to celebrate All Saints Sunday. And there's a little bit, I think, of confusion in many people's minds about what this is. The confusion is that the term saints has been used in different ways over the course of time. Paul uses it in his letters not to talk about people who are especially holy, but instead to talk about all of the faithful people who are part of the community of faith. It's a very inclusive way of referring to those who are part of the church. Later, that changed in its understanding and perception, and in the Catholic tradition, it was seen that they represented a certain perfection of humanity. A perfection that might be how they lived their lives, how they were, what they looked like, or what they did. It was also believed that they had a special in with God, so you could pray to the saints for particular needs or requests, and presumably they would messenger it up the ladder. Anglicans, of course, are a little bit more complicated. So we have kept, as Anglicans, those who were named as saints before the Reformation, but following the establishment of the Church of England, as it came to be known, we stopped beatifying people or calling them saints, and instead we talk about commemorating people. So we, like the Roman tradition, have a calendar of saints or those commemorated for different days of the year. So we do keep people, and we've become expansive in our understanding of those who are commemorated. Some are not even Episcopalians. So in that, and we tend to look at that Catholic tradition of this multiplication of, frankly, some very odd saints as somewhat amusing or baffling. And in order to give us Anglicans kind of a perspective, I have a book called Saints Preserve Us. And it's subtitled Everything You Need to Know About Every Saint You'll Ever Need. I'm happy to loan it out. It has some very odd saints that are named in this catalog. For example, did you know that St. Barbara is the saint to pray to if you're trying to ward off a volcanic explosion? Did you know that if you are standing in line at Bergdorf Goodman's, the patron saint of salespeople is St. Lucy? But perhaps most amusing but also baffling of all is St. Drogo, who is the patron saint of the unattractive. Who self-identifies with that group? So our prayers ascend today, perhaps to St. Drogo or St. Lucy or St. Barbara, but we talk about as Anglicans something that we've never disparaged or let go of, which is the communion of saints, the presence of saints in our lives. And for us as Anglicans, because our theology rests on the idea of incarnational theology, meaning we believe that God is made known and manifested in this world. The creation around us and the people in creation have a great deal to teach us about God, because creation and we are made in God's image. So part of that incarnational theology is that we believe not just in the abstraction of theology, but in the doing of theology. And that's borne out in today's gospel reading. The rather surprising Lucan account of the Beatitudes, which, by the way, is unique in that it has blessings and woes, not just blessings. But Luke's catalog of those who are blessed and those who are woeful is then followed by what we should actually do. always anchoring the teaching about God in action, as well as in what we call belief or theology. And in that idea of action, I think it's important for me to remember what exactly I think the saints are. For me, the saints are people that point us to a deeper relationship with God. They manifest in some way not perfection, not necessarily pure holiness, and certainly not necessarily piety, but a way of doing and living their life that points us towards God. The saints, for us as Episcopalians, have been likened to roadmaps or signposts that guide us by their lives to a deeper understanding and hopefully relationship with God. Now, spoiler alert, I actually believe that very often saints have nothing to do with organized religion. Not necessarily at all with the established church, with the establishment, the organization, the system of the church. Very often, I think people who point us towards God are not part of that tradition, or it's not obvious what part of that tradition they are. But I believe they have a profound lesson if we will only hear. And so, in the Episcopal tradition, in your prayer books, you can look and see that we have included for those holy days people like Dr. Martin Luther King, Martin Luther himself, other people outside of our tradition perhaps, but who taught us something profound about our lives and about God. And that teaching is what saints, I think, do at their best. Sure, if I'm ever near an exploding volcano, I may have a word with St. Barbara. But the day-to-day living out of what it means to believe in the communion of saints is something much closer to home. It's the people in our lives that teach us about God, teach us something about the nature of God and God's love for us. So I'm going to tell you three very quick stories about people who I consider to be signposts or guideposts to a greater truth. And because I'm a dutiful son, I'll start with my mother. You know, we think about the 1950s and early 1960s as being this kind of golden age of peace and tranquility, of stability in our society. But I think for those of you and those of us who lived through it, it wasn't quite that. Instead, there were terrible anxieties and worries and concerns, most especially related to the Cold War, which was not an abstraction, but something that we lived with as a potential terrible reality. And so in the early 1960s, my mother decided on her own to be trained as a Red Cross volunteer. And the reason was, she told us much later, was that she wanted to be able, as a Red Cross volunteer, to come into the schools if there was a nuclear attack, because she didn't want her two sons to be alone in that case. And I've always thought that that's an extraordinary thing to live with as you send your children off to school each day, but also thinking intentionally about how to live our lives. And that lesson, or that mirroring of, I think, God's intentional, unconditional love for us is lived out in people, and I think in this case, my mother's choices and her decision. The second comes from a experience I had at Messiah Rhinebeck. When I got to Messiah, I expected in a 125-year-old parish, 150-year-old parish at that point, a lot of archives, a lot of stuff that talked about our past. What I hadn't counted on was the large number of IBM executives that were part of the parish. Now, if you remember, IBM had a policy that was anti-clutter. Paper was anathema. You cleared your desk of extraneous paperwork. And unfortunately, many of those executives brought that to our archives at Messiah. We had very little in terms of records of the church. We had exhaustive records of who didn't pay their pew rental in the 1890s, but we lacked any record of, for example, what was the vestry thinking when they made the decision to build a new church in 1901? What was it like in the church at the outbreak of the Civil War? What was it like the morning of Pearl Harbor for Messiah Rhinebeck? No record at all. And that's not unusual, I don't think, for parishes. But at one point, we decided we better have bylaws, and someone remembered that we had them at one time. And I poked around up in the attic, and I found 2 cartons of papers that the IBM executives had missed. And so we dragged them downstairs, and we spread them all out. There were some treasures. For example, a letter from FDR announcing that we should at Messiah be aware that he was the first sitting president to ever conduct divine worship on a yacht, Vincent Astor's yacht. I treasure that. Had it framed immediately. But among the papers, we found some vestry records from the 1970s, some vestry minutes. Now, in the 1970s, there was a great upheaval in the Episcopal Church. In that decade, we had the introduction of a new prayer book, the ordination of women, and greater advocacy for inclusion of gays and lesbians in the church. And Messiah must have been a fairly conservative congregation at that point, because what we found was a letter that had been drafted by the vestry and voted on by the vestry and sent to Paul Moore, our bishop, in New York City, threatening to leave the Diocese of New York should he do any of those things: introduce a new prayer book, ordain women, or include gays and lesbians in the church. And with some pride, they announced that it passed unanimously, except for one vote. And they had the statement in the minutes of that one dissenting vote from that resolution. And it was a man in the parish who said, "I appreciate serving on the vestry and honor their work, but I cannot vote for this resolution because I have a gay daughter." The third story that talks, I think, about God's love and God's inclusiveness in loving us and the bidding of us to be inclusive in our love comes from a time when I was a layperson in New York City. And I may have told this story, but part of the joy of having me as your priest is we're going to start repeating stories at some point. I forget them. I hope you do too. I was serving on the vestry at St. Ignatius Antioch in New York City, 87th and West End Avenue, near to where I lived in the late 1970s. And as part of our life together as a vestry, we had an annual retreat that we would go on, an overnight retreat, and we would go to the House of the Redeemer in New York City and spend the time planning and talking about our work as a vestry. And the first night that we gathered together on the retreat, the rector gathered us after dinner in the library and asked us to speak about our greatest or most memorable moment of experiencing God. And of the 12 vestry members that were there, each went around the room speaking very movingly and powerfully about something that we as Episcopalians don't really always talk about, which is if there is a direct experience of God that's formed our faith. But the last person to speak was a man who had been very quiet. And what he had to say, I've never forgotten, and actually changed my understanding of faith. Because he said, I've loved listening to all of your stories, and I'm profoundly moved by them. But I have to say, I live in hope of having an experience of God, but it hasn't happened yet. And I couldn't help but think, Jesus, if this were a parable, would have said, who has the greatest faith in that group? Is it not the person who lives to have faith, or the people who profess it? It's an interesting question. For me, all those stories point to people who were certainly not saints in the understanding of purity and piety and holiness. But for me, each of them changed the way I see my life, the world around me, people in it, and most importantly, my understanding of God. So this All Saints' Day, I think we have to say, what do we learn from people that we love? For people who have taught us something perhaps very unexpectedly about the nature of God, about how God is intentional, how God is unconditional in God's love, how God can be courageous, being the voice that speaks against a majority, or about how someone can speak out of doubt or questioning and point us to a greater life of faith. All of these things are lessons learned from ordinary people. You know, the hymn we just sang is so beautiful. Who are these like stars appearing? And for me, they're stars in the way that we're on a journey on the sea, trying to navigate our lives by looking and tracking the stars. People who have lived lives that offer us something to learn about God. And for them, on this All Saints Sunday and always, I give thanks. Amen.